how did our lives change in the last, let's say now, 2 years? Of course, there are lots and lots of changes that I am not going to talk about in detail. But one thing that I would like to talk about in detail is that simply everybody has become a global problem solver. So you still remember the times when basically organizations communicated with each other as pyramid to pyramid, and typically information went upwards and then went over and then went downwards in the other organization. And there was a fairly limited but very active globe-trotting class, not just management, but also specialists, for example. So if you look at, let's say, forensic bookkeepers, or if you look at medical professionals or helicopter mechanics, there was a relatively small minority that traveled all over the world and took care of global projects. What happened during the past couple of years, not just because of COVID, but also because the general trend that the world went, is that many of these people stayed where they were before, and they connected with each other digitally. So this did lots of different things I'm going to talk about, but one very important thing is that if we look at the two organizations as two pyramids facing each other, then information now is crisscrossing the world on all levels of the organization, which means somebody who's solving a technical problem or solving a legal problem can directly connect to somebody who is working on the same problem or on the corresponding end of that problem at the other side of the world. Now, a lot of people are simply not prepared for that. A lot of people, basically, they signed up to their professional tasks knowing that they would be the technical problem solvers and others would take care of the communication, and very specifically, the intercultural communication aspect of that job. So basically, to put it very simple, not everybody likes it that they are sitting in an office working on an engineering problem or a legal problem or a financial problem, and they directly have to reach out to Rio de Janeiro or Mumbai or Cape Town or Shanghai. Now, an interesting thing is that we assume that technology would take care of this, because technology is a fairly democratic and culturally neutral space, as we assume it. But I'm going to show you a couple of things that tell us that that is not necessarily true. So we still have to be aware of significant differences between professional cultures, national cultures, and others in the way people use technology to connect with each other. I had a half sentence just now about why we assume that the technological space, let's say like a Zoom call that we are using right now, or a database like a CRM system, or a virtual team platform like Skrill, is a culturally neutral technological space. So basically, we don't have to worry about culture anymore. We are all in our same locations. We are all connected in the same way. We know the rules of the game more or less. But there are a number of reasons why that wouldn't be true. So the first thing is, let's say, if we assume that, let's say, we are connecting through 3 or 4 continents at the call that we are in the middle of now. One thing is that many of those professional areas that we rely on are cultural in nature themselves. So what do I mean by this? When I do my consulting work and I tell people about the typical cultural challenges of a professional area, there are some managers who look at me and say, "Oh, Gabor, this is fascinating. You know, it's so interesting how cultures are different from each other, like the World Values Survey that I am showing you now. But also, I am so glad that I work in the field of law, in the field of finance, in the field of engineering, in the field of technology, because thank God, I don't have to worry about that cultural stuff. In my profession, the numbers speak for themselves. Finance is finance everywhere. And I can just look at, I can look at the cultural aspect of my work as a nice to have skill set as opposed to the core skill set." But if you look at research like the one from the World Values Survey here, then what it says is that all of these systems, all of these paradigms that I mentioned to you are actually cultural in nature. the legal system of a society is a very elaborate expression of what a society should look like, how people should communicate with each other, how people should resolve their differences, how people should do business with each other, how different groups like men and women, older people and younger people, different ethnic groups are supposed to interact with each other. The same thing about finance. You probably noticed that some societies are more lenient with small financial differences. So a simple example is you are supposed to, let's say, wire 10,000 US dollars or 10,000 euros. How much do you actually wire, and how much is the flexibility that is still allowed? Let's say, where does networking end and corruption begin? All of these things are actually heavily cultural in nature. If you look at technology itself, and this is my main point, it is also a culturally determined space. Why do we forget about this very often? Is that actually the culture of digital spaces is mostly defined by a business cultural mainstream that is either Western, or if it's not Western, then it comes from nations that have been part of the international commercial interaction for a long time, like Japan, like South Korea, and so on. Now, if you look at this World Value Survey map, at the left and bottom side of the survey, you find the relatively collectivist and relatively traditionalist societies. Whereas at the top right end, you find societies that are relatively individualist and relatively progressive or secular, in the sense that tradition doesn't determine the way of doing business that much. So for example, you can think about the role of religion in finance, for example, halal banking, men and women in business environments. And you can counterpose them with societies which have their own problems as well, but there is more flexibility, there is more agility between, let's say, age groups, that between sexes, and between traditional and not so traditional groups. Now, when we are doing a Zoom call or an MS Team call, then usually we follow the protocol of the relatively secular and relatively individualistic cultures. What do I mean by that? For example, in certain conferencing software, and Zoom, the one that we are using right now, is one of them, the microphone and the camera automatically tunes in to the loudest participant. So if I start speaking, then an automatic system is going to notice that I basically took control of the agenda. This is a typically extroverted, individualist approach to online collaboration. Another one would be that when you are hosting meetings, for example, we usually use this mental framework of an institution being in charge of the meeting. They are hosting it. They are providing the host, the person who is giving the word to everybody, and then us, the remaining participants, are basically guests in the digital venue of this virtual meeting. Now, let me give you another example. During COVID-19, companies very quickly and flexibly switched to working from home through digital means. This is relatively easy in societies where people have spacious and quiet homes with not so many people inside of them, where they can have a relaxed and focused time in front of a camera, exactly the way I am talking to you now. But just think about what happens if I live in a multi-generational home, if I live in a very tiny home where I can literally hear what the neighbors are doing, if I'm living in a home without good connectivity, if I'm living in a home which is in a climate that doesn't require thick walls and windows. So then suddenly this collaboration method is going to be much more challenging. Now, this World Values Survey is basically about nations. but also within nations, there are differences between different socio-economic strata, so to speak, or subgroups. For example, relatively more affluent people and less affluent people. And the kind of conferencing that we are using right now is much more suitable for somebody who has a higher income. So basically, we can buy ourselves the peace, the quiet, the space in the form of a home or in form of, let's say, renting a meeting room in a rented office. Now, just imagine a couple of alternatives. What would happen if the technology that we are using now did not come from the United States and Western Europe and a couple of other places like Singapore? Then what would happen, for example, is that we would assume that when somebody joins a video call, we join as a group, not as an individual. So probably you had Zoom calls when you are calling in one location and actually the camera is in a room, in a little bit like a security camera. People are sitting around the table or people are sitting with a couple of armchairs, and then they are looking at the camera as a team. Then, for example, who is talking at the minute and who is the leader of the meeting, so to speak, it becomes much more difficult to decide. It would be a little bit confusing to participants. I am from Hungary, for example. I would probably be a little bit less confused than somebody from, let's say, the United Kingdom or the northeast coast of the United States. But this is an alternative, and technology would actually allow it to happen.